And what we have wound up with is 100 years of very piecemeal legislation, generally not enforced, until we came to two important pieces of legislation, and I dare say we'll be talking about those. However, as all of us know, that legislation was significantly undermined by the 2010 ruling Citizens United. And why should the League care so much about this? I think because the aftermath of that has been a real loss of confidence in the system, in elections, in candidates, in special interests influence, and the League cares deeply about how elections are run, about the confidence that people have in them, and about getting good people to run. I think one of the most significant impacts of money in politics is that it makes good people very reluctant to step forward unless they know they have the backing of special interests. So I commend the League on taking stands. I won't get into issues because Rick wants us to answer his question. So I will pass on to my colleagues.
Aubrey?
All right, well, thanks for having me here today. And what I've done is develop my top 10 list a la David Letterman, of course no longer on TV, so we miss him. I don't know if I'll get through 10 in 3 minutes, but we'll see what I can do. Money is a driving force in politics, and the total amount increases almost every election. On the one hand, this could be a good thing if it raises awareness of candidates and issues and increases public debate. It can also be a bad thing. Big money interest may influence policy in ways that the average voter doesn't want. 2, spending money on politics is considered a First Amendment free speech right and is constitutionally protected by the courts. 3, restrictions on donations directly to candidates have been allowed by the courts because it's a compelling government interest to avoid the perception that candidates are for sale to the highest bidder. 4, restrictions on election spending have usually not been allowed by the courts because candidates, people, and groups can spend as much as they want as they can legally raise. 5, there are 2 sets of extremely complicated and detailed campaign finance laws, one at the national level, one at the state level. So for instance, donations to candidates and parties are different for state candidates in Florida than they are for national candidates in Florida. 6, whenever campaign finance laws are passed, new loopholes are found and exploited. Individuals and groups want to spend money to influence elections and public policy. 7, there are limits on donations to candidates, but there are no limits or few limits on donations to nonprofit organizations, such as super PACs, 501c3 and c4 organizations, 527s, and in Florida, since the recent reforms, our political action committees and ECOs are allowed to take unlimited donations. 8, because they are not limited in donation amounts, the amount raised and spent by outside groups often dwarfs the amount now raised and spent by the candidates themselves. 9, the candidate or issue that spends the most money usually wins, but not always. Jeb Bush, President again. 10, last but not least, because of First Amendment protections, the best defense for democracy is quick, accurate, in full disclosure of who gave it and who got it when it comes to money.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. Now, Mike.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. The last time I was here, I was basically cussed out for working for Fox News. So let me start by being very clear that I am not Bill O'Reilly. I'm not Sean Hannity. I work for the local Fox affiliate here, where we work very hard to provide you with an unbiased newscast and a look at things. We don't give opinions unless you can get me up here on stage and catch me in a rare moment. So I'll give you a little bit of opinion today. I'll try to stay away from that. But I thought with all of this focus on Citizens United, and all of the talking we're going to do today about these national elections, that I might challenge you to potentially think about our local elections here. And to think about how raising money plays the exact same role and how important it is. in the local elections as it is in the national elections. And unfortunately, here in Orlando, and some of you in the audience may be a part of this, and I apologize to you in advance if you are a lawyer at Gray Robinson or one of the other major firms in town, but in terms of who gets elected in this town, it is often left to a small group of people that can raise money within that, and I'm going to use a bad word, and I'm really sorry again to all of you out there that may be a part of this, but that downtown cabal, if you will, that really controls the way politics works in this town because they are the ones that give the money and support the candidates with the most veracity. So if you don't consider yourself in that group, maybe it's time that you look at how do I affect this system? How do I get involved in a way that a small number of people in this town don't control who wins and who loses elections in this town? I would challenge you to look at that. The other thing that, from a local media member's perspective, that is so difficult to deal with in terms of how we cover the raising and spending of campaign donations, is finding out exactly where it comes from. And I'll bring up what happened to Mildred Hernandez as a good example, because basically what she was accused of and subsequently convicted of was taking bundled contributions and putting down names of people that were not actually giving the money. And so as a reporter, this for us is very difficult to wade through in a simple campaign contribution form when we go and we read these reports. In terms of, in a larger picture, in a Citizens United sort of picture, what's the answer? Most people are not going to agree with me on this, especially the League of Women Voters. But I've always thought it would be a really simple answer just to have people, citizens, actual registered voters, allowed to give as much money as they wanted to any candidate that they wanted with full disclosure, and that's it. Registered voters are the only people that would be allowed to give to the actual candidate themselves. And if corporations wanted to get involved in that, then they would have to give as income to registered voters. If associations wanted to get involved in that, they would have to give income. That would be taxed as to registered voters. And then that way you would have full disclosure of exactly who was supporting who and when.
Okay, thank you. Linda, what do you want to do about money in politics?
I'm a little confused as to why Mike thinks the league would be against. Did you say limiting contributions to registered voters?
Registered voters would be able to give unlimited sums.
Well, then let me point out that the problem we have right now is the exact opposite of that. Real people, like you and me, are limited in what we can give. This is very confusing to the voters who watch special interests, big money, give as much as they choose to. So somehow this is inherently contradictory. I would like to see Citizens United revisited. Now that's probably going to be difficult to accomplish. But the fact is that 80% of American voters think they've been bamboozled. They disapprove of Citizens United. They think it was a bad ruling. And if you look back on the history, as boring as I said it was, you will find that frequently the Supreme Court has taken a different view of this free speech issue. So perhaps there is a possibility, along with some other ideas that there's not time to talk about.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question of Aubrey and then turn the conversation or dialogue over to the audience here. What we have microphones that are or will be rolling in the audience. So Aubrey, I want to ask you about the McCutcheon case, because you referenced it indirectly. But there was a Citizens United case that followed some other decisions that said that money was speech and protected that right. Then came the McCutcheon decision afterwards that on one hand did away with the aggregate limit on what someone could donate, but that's where there was this famous debate between Chief Justice Reynolds and Stephen Breyer about the limits to campaign contributions, because Reynolds said, yeah, you have a First Amendment right to make contributions, and that could be limited. It's a limited right. He said it could be limited if corruption could be shown. What's corruption? Well, corruption is a quid pro quo, a specific quid pro quo. I'll give you this money if in return you purchase my property for more than it is worth. And Breyer said, no. The test here is integrity, the integrity of our political institutions. Not corruption in the narrow sense, but a broader issue of political equality and the appearance of political equality and the integrity of our democratic institutions. So, Aubrey, what about that debate? What should be the test for deciding when the First Amendment freedom to contribute should be limited?
Well, I think I would come down on the side of Justice Breyer on this one rather than Chief Justice Roberts. I'm not against what Chief Justice Roberts said. Clearly, we don't want direct, outright corruption and bribery of our elected officials. And if we see that, we would know that the average American would then have less faith and confidence in the electoral system as a whole. But I don't think we need to wait for that or just say, oh, we have to find these things that happen. Rather, I think it makes sense. And I think if you go back to the original Supreme Court case, not to bore everybody, 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo, they took the broader view because they said we are going to uphold what Congress has passed as far as restrictions on donating directly to candidates for the broad reason that we don't want people to think that their politicians are for sale, that we don't think it's just the highest bidder, whoever gives the most is the one that influences the candidate. The public has to know in a representative democracy that their elected officials represent the interests of everyone and not just somebody that come in and directly give them $100,000 in a suitcase, as often happened during the Nixon years, not just on Nixon, but to everyone back in the early 70s before these laws were passed.
How's that working out, by the way?
Well, as I said, I can't remember which number it was, but every time we pass rules, we have people that find loopholes because people want, and groups want to spend money to influence public policy in elections. And so the last thing I'll say before we open it up is, I think the biggest loophole now is that we can have these groups that can raise and spend unlimited amounts, particularly say the 501c4 groups, which don't even have to say who's giving them the money. And then they can spend millions and millions of dollars. And so it sort of outweighs, in many instances, what the candidates themselves are raising and spending. So yeah, I think it's one of those loopholes, and I assume they'll at some point try to go after that one, and when they do close that one, then something else will open up.
And I would point out that Justice Kennedy, in writing the majority decision for Citizens United, claimed that these new rules, corporations giving unlimited amounts, et cetera, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. Now, I think that might be grounds for revisiting the case, since most of the American people seem to think that there is at least the appearance.
Yeah. Okay, while the microphone is go to the Channel 9 website, where I have a blog that appears weekly, where I made the argument that we should agree with the Senate Majority Leader and let the people decide and wait till after the next election to fill out the Supreme Court, because the next president will probably have the opportunity to appoint 4 justices to the Supreme Court. Unprecedented except during the New Deal. 2 would be replacements of Democrat nominees, but the other 2 not. So we could have a real judicial revolution in the next 4 to 8 years. So I see someone standing with my
Okay, if you're interested in asking a question, just a reminder, you must be a League of Women Voters member. So they are taking cash and credit cards right now. If you're not a League member,
No free speech here, folks.
And also,
There is money in this politics, though.
and I'm much stronger than I look, so keep your questions to 30 seconds or you're cut off. There we go.
Right, Charlie, league member. My question for the panel is if you could give us context on what it costs to run for office for Florida House, Florida Senate, put you together for U.S. Congress. I know we've got a U.S. Senate race, and it used to be, maybe 6 years ago, cost $20 million. So what do you think those numbers are? Because it really gets down to that escalating campaign cost.
You want me to take a quick stab? From from my memory, of winning House of Representative candidate in Florida, at least 200,000, average 200,000 for a Florida Senate candidate, at least $500,000 or more. For a congressional race, probably at least a couple million to be competitive, and that certainly can go up quite a bit if you're in a very competitive race. If you're in one of the half dozen districts that actually is considered a toss-up. For the U.S. Senate race, it's hard to give an average because it just varies so widely state to state, and even in Florida can vary widely depending on how competitive the election is. But I would say at least 10 million in a large state like Florida. In some smaller states where there's not as much competition, it can be much less. But in bigger states, it can be much more. We have seen, for instance, in New Jersey, California, $50, $60 million worth of candidates.
And it makes a big difference whether you have, like Florida does, a number of different media markets. Isn't that right?
Huge difference because of the cost of advertising in those markets where, you cannot win the state of Florida without investing heavily in both Tampa and Orlando as markets. If your home base is Miami and you're already well enough known there not to have to pour millions into advertising in Miami, then there's Palm Beach, then there's Jacksonville, then there's Pensacola and Tallahassee. All of these are separate, and Fort Myers as well, all separate media markets where you have to have separate contracts for your advertising. Governor Scott spent right around $100 million on his re-election.
Next question.
I just want to point out to the panelists, the timekeeper has moved back here, so if you guys pay attention, she's holding up her stop sign periodically.
I'm not sure I can see that.
All right, she'll stand up. And here we have a new league member that paid his dues before he asked the question last month, so anybody can follow suit if they want to. Here we go.
Hey, Blake.
Good morning, Scott Kidd. Quick comment, which is, of course, we're very thrilled that super PACs cannot coordinate with candidates, so we know there's no interest there. But the question is specifically for Orange County, seeing as how the Supreme Court of Florida has ruled that tourist tax can be used for something other than sports arenas and convention centers, how much money do you expect to be spent here in this area for candidates and issues supporting keeping the tourist tax money spent on expanding convention centers?
Well, I think that ruling may be a little more limited than, I think it's definitely going to take state legislation before any dollars can flow that way. But, you can expect the hoteliers, the tourists to protect what is theirs now, or what they believe to be theirs now. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And if you look at what's trending is in Tallahassee, they're up there right now trying to figure out how do we get our hands on Orange County's tourist tax money, because the pot of Orange County, the $225 million that we raise in tourist taxes, dwarfs everything else in the state. So there's been legislation that was filed last session that didn't make it, that would have allowed these new types of spending if and only if Orange County coughed up its tourist tax and sent it up to Tallahassee to be distributed throughout the rest of the state. So more so than I think you'll see the hoteliers trying to protect their own through the elections and the voters, I think you'll see the hoteliers trying to protect their own through the lobbyists in Tallahassee, because the rest of this state desperately wants to get their hands on our tourist tax money.
I think it would help their effort if they would relax a little the grip they have on that tourist tax money. And the recent proposal to give money to the arts is a good start, but if you compare what they're willing to give to the arts to what the proposal has for their own industry, it's not exactly on par.
And I would just say, if we look at this in an interstate comparison, like say out in Nevada, Las Vegas, they do spend tourist tax money on a variety of things with the thought that tourists should help support the infrastructure needed to have a healthy tourist economy. And so whether that's education or police, fire, EMT, roads, all those things. I mean, to me, logically, it just makes a lot of sense. And as we all know, logic doesn't always necessarily flow into politics, but hopefully in this case, with effort and time and a lot of hard work, we will eventually see some of that money spent on other things than just tourist development.
And I'd like to go back to something that I brought up earlier, which is, what's the biggest change you'd like to see? And I said, more people voting being the solution. If 85% of Orange County and the city of Orlando voted, do you think we would have seen that tourist tax plan? And the way it was discussed and the way they tried to send it through quickly? Do you think that any candidate running for office would not advocate if 85% of people voted? Every politician running for office would be out there advocating that we use that money to fix our roads and to make our schools better and to build mass transit to and from the parks.
Mayor Chapin, we brought out the big gun just because you requested it. We're ready to move on now. So the timekeeper is prepared. He is prepared. Here we go. Next question.
This may be a naive question, but it seems to me, if you're talking about media, you mean television, right? Not the internet, not newspaper ads, whatever. You're talking about the internet. You're talking about television. Do they have any responsibility? It seems like they're the ones benefiting from the millions being spent on campaigns. Is there any responsibility or limitation on how much they can charge for their access?
There are limitations on how much we can charge based on whether the money is coming from the candidate itself or whether it's coming from one of these super PACs. And when it's coming from the super PAC, we're not limited in how much we can charge. So we benefit a great deal from taking the money from the super PAC instead of from the candidate themselves, where we have to offer the lowest rate. Do we bear and hold a responsibility to do a better job of bringing you election coverage? I believe that. I believe that you believe that. The problem is the ratings don't match that. I would love to give you guys a 10-minute discussion tonight at 6 o'clock on the news about John Kasich accepting the Medicaid dollars and what kind of result that had in Ohio. I present you the negative side of it, and I present you the positive side of it. I'd love to let you decide. The ratings would go in the toilet. I give you Donald Trump saying, "Look at how big my hands are," the ratings explode. So we do have a greater responsibility, but at the same time, we're nothing more than a big mirror. And we're going to reflect back what you are the most interested in, as sad as that is.
And people who vote, there's plenty of blame to go around. We can't just point to the media. We can't just point to Citizens United. We can't just say it's somebody else's fault. If we're not turning out to vote, we're a big part of the problem.
And I would just add, I think most of the money still does go directly to TV, but that is changing over time. I don't know about all you all, but when I watch TV, most of the time now I'm taping programs. I'm still old-fashioned. I still do have cable television. I'm not like the younger generation that's totally cut the cable. But I tape a lot of stuff. And I didn't realize how much that put me behind the 8 ball on commercials until I was watching episodes of Jeopardy and seeing commercials 3 weeks after the Florida primary, and there was, Donald Trump and Marco Rubio making his last plea and all that. So I do think, bottom line is, I think it's going to change over time, and we're going to see more going to internet and radio and things that, media that people are taking live.
I'm sure that Mike would agree that the Federal Communications Commission could require public service time.
And we run a public service program.
Licensing.
Yeah, and they do.
Reduce the cost of campaigning.
We run a program every single Saturday morning on My 65 called Orlando Matters, and I've done them all now, all candidates, with the exception of Augustus Invictus, I believe it is, the Libertarian. We have run a 10-minute segment with each of the United States Senate candidates over the course of the past 4 to 5 months. But again, the ratings for that show are awful.
Is it at 6 a.m. Saturday?
That's 7 a.m. on Saturday night.
Competing with cartoons, prime time would be better, wouldn't it? So, another question? Next question.
I apologize if I didn't understand it earlier when you were talking about limitations to contributions being registered voters only. Would that apply to just candidates, or does that also apply to PACs? Or it wasn't clear what your stance was on PACs.
I mean, you could have an association, a PAC, if you will, a political action committee, but they couldn't spend any money. They would have to give the money to a registered voter in order for that money to be spent. And that being my point is, look, I understand that people love the idea of public financing or of elections or limiting what corporations can contribute, limiting what associations of people can contribute, but it's basically going to run afoul of the Supreme Court virtually every time. I mean, it has in the past, and it will, because people can band together and speak as a group, and that's their First Amendment right. Does that right extend to a corporation? The Supreme Court recently said yes in Citizens United. I happen to disagree with that decision. So my point is, we've got to find some kind of way to allow what will always be allowed by the courts, which is our free speech, and yet preserve some kind of right to know who is spending the money and why. And that's why my suggestion would be that only registered voters would be able to give money. And so that if any corporation or any, in this case, super PAC, wanted to be involved in the political process, they'd literally have to give that money as income to a registered voter. That registered voter would have to report it and pay taxes on it.
That might present even more problems, though, Mike.
Possibly,
And
yes.
would surely run afoul of an equal protection clause if only registered voters could give money. The whole idea that money is speech and corporations are people, it just doesn't make walking around sense. I think full disclosure tomorrow would be a good start towards solving the problem. But in the end, we've got to address those two basic questions, and that might take a new court ruling, or it might take a constitutional amendment. How many of you are up for a 30-year slog on a new constitutional amendment?
Next.
Our co-president's cutting the line in our last meeting.
I have a question about the super PACs too. I've read somewhere that they will be spending $1 billion for this election cycle, which is pretty incredible. But it's about the dark money, the fact that they can have ads, and most of their ads are negative ads, and then the candidate can disown it and say, well, I have nothing to do with that ad. You know, it was my super PAC. That lack of transparency and accountability is what is so disturbing about the money from the super PAC.
What do you think about that as a question?
It's very disturbing, yes, but maybe there's a glimmer of light out there somewhere. Big money doesn't seem to have played nearly the role in this presidential primary that we might have expected it to, or that Jeb Bush might have expected it to. Let's look at the relative expenditures among the candidates, and I don't think this time, at least, there's a direct correlation between those who have spent the most and those who have gotten the most votes. Maybe people are waking up to negative campaigning.
$26 million, I believe it was spent on ads against Donald Trump in the state of Florida, and he won the state easily. The problem is, in order to get to the point that we've arrived at in this presidential cycle, the candidate has to be so far beyond well-known that it doesn't work. I mean, we've got Hillary Clinton as the potential Democratic nominee, and we've got Donald Trump as the potential Republican nominee. Everybody knows who those people are. So how do you introduce yourself without that money? In terms of the super PACs, we went yesterday. It was yesterday we went and asked Rick Scott, why did Let's Get to Work run the ad against the woman in the coffee shop who yelled at him? And let me tell you, I ask Governor Scott tough questions every single time I see him. I never get an answer from him. In this case, that was my super PAC. You'll have to go talk to them.
Just for the record, it took an hour before someone mentioned the name Donald Trump.
These are our
That's
two.
pretty good.
These are our two final questions.
So, looking at Bill the Burr and Bernie Sanders, you talked about somebody that wasn't well known. And are you seeing social media and digital becoming an equalizer for big money, because he's raised more money than Hillary Clinton has? And it's all been in those dollar donations. So how do you see that impact as we move forward as an equalizer with the super PAC?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think when I was talking about where the big interest are spending money buying commercial time and how they might be moving away from TV. The same thing can be said for raising money. If you look at the internet and how that has allowed candidates to much more easily interact with supporters, whether they're local or whether they're across the country, it's really just amazing over the last decade. And you've seen several candidates who are very, very successful at it. In the presidential race, Bernie Sanders, locally, Alan Grayson was a master at it, maybe still will be, we'll see in his U.S. Senate race, but as a congressional candidate, he raised several $1 million, but almost all of it in smaller donations from tens of thousands of people across the country. So it definitely has the possibility, to some degree, of counteracting the effect of big money.
And I do think that part of that effect, which is beginning to work, is because people are waking up to the problems inherent in this new court ruling and in our election system, and they're much more willing to participate, don't you think?
I do, and just go through your Facebook feed tonight and see if you see Carlos Baruf anywhere, because he's been advertising heavily as a U.S. Senate candidate on Facebook. And so digital, as people move away from television ratings are down, sadly for me. This is where people are at. People are on Facebook, and so as people move there, so will the candidates and the money.
And our final question.
So we've discussed the general idea that speech is money, or that money is speech. But the courts haven't really addressed recently the quality of that speech. Is it time to revisit the 50-year-old libel laws when it comes to public officials, which would stop some of that money? And also, the court has not addressed the anonymity of political speech as well. They continue to uphold disclosure laws. Is it time to expand the disclosure laws, such as federal candidates that actually have to be on the screen approving and disapproving an ad, unlike super PACs that can run little disclaimers?
Did I hear a get off my back, Mike, in that question hidden in there somewhere? Changing the libel laws? I would just say this, that in terms of is it time to revisit that? I mean, it's 50 years, so absolutely. That not everything should and can go in the public sphere. Should we go as far as Donald Trump wants to do, where media can be easily sued? It may be very well time for that, based on some of the things that we've seen being so blatantly inaccurate in the media.
Issue than the ones we've been talking about. Once you start trying to decide who can say what about whom, that really does get complicated. Full disclosure and timely disclosure. If someone gives a large amount of money to a super PAC, we ought to know that within 24 hours. There's no reason with today's technology that can't happen. Instead, we have these artificial reporting, well, they're not artificial, they're in law, but we have these reporting periods that you can go for months on end without knowing who's contributing to a candidate or to a PAC.
And I would just second that. That was my number 10 on my list, which is we need, and this is what's doable fairly quickly in the shorter run. We need to have better who gave it, who got it laws. We need to know who's giving the money and who's receiving the money, and we need to know it when the voting is still occurring, not a month or 3 months after when the final reports are filed. And that won't solve all the problems, but the libertarian in me says that will help. Because we open up government, we still allow people to spend, well, the court's allowing them to spend, but at least we know who's trying to influence, and particularly if we can require that the people that are doing it, not these crazy name, well, they're not crazy, but not these weird named super PACs with, they always sound good, but you don't know who they really are. Right, yeah, the Committee for Great Democracy, or something. But anyway, so I just wanted to second, I agree that in the short run is the best strategy I see to trying to take a step in the right direction for cleaning up the bad influence of money in politics. Not all bad, but in some cases it is, and this would be a step in the right direction.
I hear a bell ringing somewhere. Thank you, panelists.